Before alarm clocks, antibiotics, or indoor plumbing, there was porridge. In case you've ever wondered what eternity tasted like, porridge was a solid guess. If you were born in, say, a medieval village with more sheep than surnames, you probably greeted each day with three thoughts. Is the thatch leaking again? Will my foot rot off by lunchtime? And, porridge, again. But under all that beige mush and drafty clothing lingered a deadly truth. You didn't need an assassin, a war, or even a bear to die back then. All it took was a cough, one minor ache, a splash of fever, and the next thing you knew, the village bell rang slowly as someone borrowed your boots. Permanently. So why exactly were simple illnesses so perilous for our ancestors? Why did symptoms that today would warrant a hot bath and chicken noodle soup once meant the town priest got called before the soup even boiled? Let us begin where so many endings began. Sniffles. The first, culprit, of course, was knowledge, or rather, the vast and flavorful absence of it. For most of history, understanding disease was like chasing a ghost through fog, blindfolded, while being hit with a broom. If a child burned with fever, the culprit might be considered a bad wind, a mischievous fairy, or someone sneezing at the wrong phase of the moon. Medicine operated somewhere between experimental cookery and pure superstition. Take the notion of humours, not the funny kind, although they were certainly humorous in hindsight. The ancient Greeks taught that our bodies were governed by four strange juices: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If one got too ambitious, you became ill. Too much phlegm must be why you're lying in bed groaning like an old door. The cure? Probably leeches. Leeches, in case you're unfamiliar, are slimy worms whose hobbies included drinking your blood and being collected by enthusiastic 14th century practitioners. People believed, quite sincerely, that removing your blood helped restore balance. The logic was, if you're sick, less of you might be the solution. This theory, though charming in its own way, was about as effective as solving a sinking boat by scooping out the water and your organs. Still, leeching, bloodletting, and herb brewing by candlelight continued for centuries, with mixed and mostly fatal results. Of course, the real enemy loomed far, far away from the suspiciously jolly apothecary shaking powdered toad into a stew. Germs, tiny, unseeable, and absolutely thriving. For most of human history, no one had any idea they existed. Watching someone flinch at a sneeze made about as much sense as blaming a sneeze on the devil's pet, which some people absolutely did. The concept of germs only popped into public awareness relatively late, like a surprise party hosted centuries after its intended date. Until then, everything was about smells. Miasma theory held that bad-smelling air caused sickness. Not just the smell of dead things, but night air, laundry air, neighbours' soup air. If a plague broke out, people thought the scent itself was venomous. They wore masks stuffed with flowers. They waved perfumed handkerchiefs like noble teenagers avoiding gym class. Entire cities were fumigated with smoke and incense, though unfortunately not the kind that kills bacteria, just the kind that makes everything smell like cinnamon despair. Of course, poor sanitation didn't help. Most people lived near waste, walked through it, or thought bathing was a shifty habit at best. In medieval Europe, the average villager bathed perhaps once or twice a year, and bodies of water were viewed with suspicion unless you were filling a bucket and boiling it into mushy grains. Doctors, if you could afford one, often had no university education, and those who did were often less dentist and more horoscope enthusiast. Diagnosis went something like this. Your urine is cloudy and Mars is in retrograde. Might be the spleen or a miffed spirit. Either way, here's a poultice made from lizard ashes and sighs. If you couldn't afford a doctor, good news. There was the local wise woman. She may have known more than the doctor, but also ran the risk of being accused of witchcraft, especially if you got better. It really was lose-lose. Compounding all of this, immune systems. People weren't weak. They simply lived in a microbial renaissance fair. Every pond, cough, and flea was its own tiny biological lottery, and almost everyone lost. Add famine, add rats, add the perfectly normal decision to store food next to manure, and small wonder a mild tummy ache could result in eternal rest. Even childbirth, now often supported by sterile gloves and epidurals, was like playing a game of chance without any dice, just screams, herbs, and one anxious midwife whose hands still smelled like onions. So yes, it's painfully true that a toothache could lead to death, that a cold might become pneumonia, that a splinter could mean sepsis. But somehow people endured, not always cleanly or comfortably or even remotely sanely, but they did. And that's worth remembering, because behind every crooked smile in a 17th century portrait is someone who beat the odds, or at the very least, lived long enough to complain about the porridge. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, close your eyes gently, and I'll tell you about the strange and smoky world of ancient sanitation. Before there were hospitals with fluorescent lights and vending machines that refused to dispense your snack, there were healers in huts, cloaked in mystery, herbs, and, sometimes, chicken entrails. And while modern humans fear taxes and poorly worded emails, our distant ancestors feared fevers. Even something as seemingly trivial as a sniffle could escalate faster than an awkward encounter at a medieval banquet. You see, illness in early societies wasn't merely a nuisance. It was often an unforeseen event with the dramatic flair of a Greek tragedy, minus the chorus. A simple cold could spiral into something deadly, much like small talk at a family reunion. But why? What made ordinary ailments act like villainous plot twists in humanity's early chapters? The answer begins, as such answers often do, with the lack of knowledge, soap, and sufficient skepticism toward moldy cheese. Let's go back to a time when people believed that sneezing too loudly might startle the soul out of the body. If you caught a fever, it wasn't because your co-worker from the wool-dyeing hut didn't cover his mouth. No, it was because you had angered a spirit, walked past the wrong tree, or eaten a carrot that looked vaguely accusatory. Germs were not invited to the conversation. Germ theory was still several centuries and countless preventable funerals away. Now picture the average early healer. Equal parts enthusiast and improviser, armed with local herbs, trial and error wisdom, and sometimes a suspicious fondness for powdered mineral fragments. They were the doctors of their day. And by doctors, I mean conglomerates of superstition, intuition, and the occasional guesswork involving goat marrow. Without microscopes or antibiotics, a simple infection had ample opportunity to settle in and throw a rager in your bloodstream. A stubbed toe might turn into gangrene. A nick from a flint knife could evolve into sepsis. Even mild childhood diseases today, like measles, were once the medieval version of a pop star. Everyone got it, and not everyone made it to the encore. And remember, people back then didn't have Google to misdiagnose themselves. They had stars, dreams, and neighbors who once saw someone sneeze and die 3 days later. If you were lucky, your community had a wise elder who knew how to brew willow bark tea for fevers. If you were unlucky, your healer tried bleeding you into wellness, based on the entirely logical theory that if you lost enough blood, the illness would get bored and leave. Of course, cleanliness didn't exactly hold a Michelin star in early societies. Personal hygiene was more popular in concept than in execution, limited by cold water, scarce soap, and the prevailing belief that bathing too often weakened the body, or worse, attracted demons. Which is arguably a fair point. Imagine the spookiest ghost you can conjure. Likely filthy, probably moist. Bathing aside, water sources themselves were fickle allies. Wells, streams, and rivers, usually charismatic enough to star in local folktales, often carried an invisible chorus of bacteria. Drinking from nature's cup frequently led to dysentery, the sincerest of icky illnesses. There's nothing dreamier than a historical figure writing dramatic poetry between bouts of gastrointestinal agony. But perhaps the most dangerous element of early illness was the sense of stoic normalcy it carried. People expected that illness and suffering were parts of life, like cold winters or untrustworthy kings. Children didn't always grow up. Adults often didn't grow old. And sneezes didn't get bless yous, so much as worried side eyes and whispered prayers in case it meant a plague was on the guest list again. It is both oddly sad and strangely poetic that many societies framed illness through stories and symbols. In ancient Mesopotamia, ailments were sometimes blamed on angry spirits sent by enemies. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates theorized about bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were too melancholic, clearly your black bile was throwing a tantrum, and maybe a purgative would cheer it up. Medical care, now with bonus vomiting. As disastrous as early healthcare could be, we can't fault our ancestors too much. They did the best they could with what they had, and sometimes what they had was a turnip, some leeches, and a good story about why you shouldn't sleep under certain stars. And so, as night settles over the particular cobblestone village of your imagination, we leave behind the shadowy roots of ancient medicine. Ahead, there awaits the curious world of herbs, spells, and the fine line between healing and hocus pocus. At first glance, you might think fevers in ancient times were handled with dramatic flair, perhaps potions stirred under a full moon, or a parade of concerned villagers offering herbal compresses and solemn nods. But no, not quite. In truth, a fever in early societies was often treated with equal parts confusion, superstition, and a surprising amount of goat-related advice. You see, before germ theory, before people understood that tiny, invisible organisms were the real party crashers, illness was viewed less as a biological inconvenience and more as a cosmic punishment. The belief system flitted between divine wrath, malevolent spirits, and occasionally eating pears that weren't in season, a truly harrowing offense in some places. Take, for example, the Sumerians. These inventive folks gave us writing, wheeled vehicles, and the idea that sickness was the result of demons living rent-free in your organs. Did your head hurt? Demon. Coughing? Demon. Bad dreams after eating too much lentil stew? You guessed it. Another demon. Probably disgruntled and fond of lingering. Their remedies teetered between spiritual and surprisingly practical. On a good day, you might be offered a poultice made of dates and crushed herbs. On a more chaotic day, you might be reciting a spell while someone waved a dead animal over your head. Trust us, as bedtime rituals go, the Sumerian approach was vivid. Meanwhile, over in ancient Egypt, your average sneeze might earn you a visit from the priest-physician, an impressive individual dressed somewhere between a librarian and a falcon, depending on the occasion. The Egyptians recorded hundreds of diseases on papyrus scrolls, but without microscopes or a working knowledge of bacteria, their treatments were enthusiastic at best. Leeks, for example, weren't just food. They were medicinal wonders, sometimes inserted in places that shall remain unmentioned, especially while sleep is approaching. The Egyptian medical papyri also included enchanting instructions like to exorcise a cough, eat the heart of a donkey. Critics of this method argue that it lacks peer-reviewed results and leaves you with far more donkey than you bargained for. But perhaps most curious of all was their faith in the power of smell. Pleasant aromas were thought to draw good spirits near, while offensive odors scared away the bad ones. This optimistic olfactory philosophy meant your house might be filled with incense, garlic, myrrh, and the lingering stench of medicine gone out of hand. It's safe to say that ancient Egyptian households smelled like a candle store, had an existential crisis. Over in India, the early practitioners of Ayurveda fared a bit better in the logic department. Rooted in observation and balance, Ayurvedic medicine considered illness as a misalignment between elements, wind, bile, and phlegm. Which sounds poetic until you realize that they tried fixing this imbalance with practices like drinking cow urine. Again, not exactly endorsed by modern wellness influencers, but admirable in its own earthy commitment. Of course, none of this explains how anyone survived at all. But they did, somehow. Humans are wildly resilient creatures. We try things. We scrape tree bark. We boil berries. We chant at the moon. Occasionally, purely by accident, something works. And then someone writes it down in a dusty scroll with drawings of frogs. The real danger, however, wasn't just the illness itself. It was that no one knew what caused it. Fevers weren't seen as symptoms. They were seen as the sickness. There was no concept of secondary infections, viral incubation periods, or even the idea that washing hands could help. Instead, medicine operated like a very elaborate game of charades with the Grim Reaper. Shortness of breath. Touch your chest dramatically. Rash on your arms. Wave frantically. Hope someone knows what that means. And lest we forget, cleanliness was often kept at arm's length, partially because bathing was hard work and partially because God probably wanted us this sticky. In some eras, washing too often was believed to literally open the pores wide enough for disease to sneak in, like a mischievous squirrel entering through a window left open in spring. So fevers lingered. Coughs turned into consumption. Toothaches curled into jaw infections. And all the while, people sought wisdom from stars, from entrails, from whichever neighbor insisted he could cure anything with a well-aged toad. Winding down now, we leave behind these ancient halls of earnest misunderstanding, the incense still curling in the corners, the clay tablets etched with hopeful remedies, the quiet certainty that illness was both a mystery and a message. Next, we drift gently toward another world, where medieval malaise meets leech couture, and things get delightfully more peculiar from there. Imagine, if you will, a time before aspirin, before thermometers, before that mysterious drawstring pouch labeled herbal tea in your kitchen cabinet. Let's drift gently into the days when a sneeze could inspire either grave concern or fervent prayer, depending on the decade. In the tapestry of human history, early medical beliefs were woven from a curious blend of superstition, observation, and, let's be generous, confident guessing. Back then, illness wasn't just a malfunction of the body. It was often interpreted as a moral failing, a spiritual punishment, or the consequences of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, specifically near a person who had recently looked suspiciously sweaty. If you seemed a bit peaky in ancient Babylonia, there was a solid chance someone would recommend removing a demon via a reed, a chant, or enthusiastic smoke. In early societies, the human body was as mysterious as a locked door with no key. Theories on what made it tick and what made it stop ticking were, at best, wildly creative. The ancient Egyptians, bless their linen-wrapped ingenuity, believed that a network of canals inside the body carried various fluids, in the same way the Nile transported water. Getting sick, your internal canal system had clogged. Naturally, the solution was to make you vomit, sweat, bleed, or lose your bowels, preferably all before lunchtime. Underlying most of these beliefs was a steady and rather charming confidence in things that weren't exactly true. Take the four humours, a theory that shaped medical thinking in the West for over 1,000 years. Dreamed up by Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, this idea stated that the body was governed by four mystical fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Basically, the world's most unpleasant smoothie. Your health depended on keeping these humours balanced, kind of like trying to level a wobbly table with packets of sugar. Too much blood. You were probably feverish and needed cooling, perhaps by being placed under a damp cloth and scolded gently by a doctor wearing an alarming toga. Too much black bile. You were melancholic, an ancient term for what we now call having a bad Monday, the most fashionable prescription for imbalanced humours. Bloodletting, of course, sometimes done with leeches, sometimes done with knives, sometimes done by barber surgeons, a career path that combined giving you a trim with slicing open your vein like a baguette at brunch, a haircut and a hemorrhage, all for one low price. How efficient. Funnily enough, most of these practices didn't fix the illness, but they did make you too exhausted to complain further, which may have been the whole point. And although it's easy to laugh now at the idea of treating pneumonia by balancing bile with a thistle compress, these early societies were doing the best they could with the tools they had, namely, a few scrolls, a lot of anxiety, and an almost poetic misunderstanding of internal anatomy. For many cultures, illness didn't come from within, but from outside. Spirits, foul smells, or some frankly unreasonable planetary alignment. The ancient Chinese carefully mapped the body's meridians, believing that disruptions in the flow of qi, your life force or energy, could cause illness. Their treatments were often elaborate rituals involving herbs, acupuncture, or deeply specific dietary restrictions. If you were coughing with a tight chest, perhaps you had angered the element of wood, or your spleen was simply feeling underappreciated. Even medieval Europe gave the cosmos a say in your sniffles. Astrological medicine, or iatromathematics, meant your doctor might check your horoscope before prescribing anything. Coughing under a Cancer moon. Better avoid lentils and prepare for a sanctified poultice. Medical knowledge moved slowly, often burdened by philosophical conjecture and a spectacular lack of hygiene. A common thread, you see, in nearly all ancient approaches to illness was the severe underestimation of dirt. Germs back then were not only invisible, they were entirely undiscovered, and so cleanliness was more ceremonial than scientific. Baths were sporadic, water was mysterious, and hand-washing was a concept usually reserved for Pontius Pilate and spiritual metaphors, which meant that what early societies didn't know, was often more dangerous than what they did. They fought invisible enemies with loud prayers and leech jars. They treated headaches with relics and indigestion with chants. They feared the breath of the sick, but not, curiously, the flies on their lunch. Still, from the whispery reeds of the Nile to the smoky temples of the East, humanity was slowly learning. Every mistaken cure was a step forward, or at the very least, a memorable attempt. And nestled quietly among the herbs and incantations, beginnings of wisdom would someday bloom. But for now, rest easy. Let your mind drift gently through the candlelit corridors of ancient apothecaries and dusty scriptoriums. In the soft hush of antiquity, another mystery stirs. What truly happened when even kings and philosophers faced the commonest of ailments without a clue, or a clue shaped like a pill bottle? Imagine, if you will, a small village in the 14th century, somewhere between, probably on an old map, and definitely damp. The fog hasn't lifted since last November. Everyone's shoes are made of something that used to be a goat, and the local healer just prescribed a tincture of boiled turnip leaves and hope. Now, let's say you wake up one chilly morning with a scratchy throat. In our modern world, you might brew some tea, perhaps take something lemon-flavored and chemically advanced, and then you soldier on. But back then, the sniffles could set your fate in motion like a handcart wobbling downhill with a very nervous potato farmer inside. Illness, in early societies, was not just inconvenient. It was like accidentally writing your name in the guest book at a ghost's birthday party. Something small, a cough, a sneeze, an unsettling gurgle, could spiral into a spectacular display of bodily rebellion. Part of the trouble was that people just didn't know what was happening inside them. Take a raging fever in the year 812. Was it the result of drinking haunted well water, cursed by a particularly picky local spirit? Perhaps. Or maybe it was just that no one had washed their hands since Charlemagne took the throne. And this brings us to one of the sleepiest secrets in medical history. Early societies were, to put it gently, germ blind. You see, germ theory, the rather helpful idea that tiny invisible critters can make you sick, didn't pop into human thought until the 19th century. Before that, diagnosis was a poetic guess, and treatment was often a medieval roulette wheel. You could be bled to remove excess bad humors, which meant someone came at you with a knife and a charming disregard for veins. Or you might be prescribed a poultice of breadcrumbs, moss, or whatever was left in the back of the larder. People believed illness came from miasmas, bad air, and while it's not entirely wrong to assume that breathing in the stench of open sewers or questionable stew would dampen the mood, it wasn't quite the scientific breakthrough they hoped it was. Febrile and coughing, a patient might be dosed with odd-smelling herbs, instructed to move to a higher elevation, or, in fancier homes, tucked beneath leeches that had no formal training. Let's take poor Edric the baker as an imaginary but entirely plausible example. One morning, he wakes up with a sore tooth. Innocuous, right? Unfortunately, dentistry in his time amounted to, let's see which of your neighbours owns pliers. Edric, left untreated or overtreated, possibly in equal measure, soon finds himself unable to eat, in constant pain, and perhaps battling a delightful dental abscess that spreads an infection through his jaw and into his bloodstream. Suddenly, all because of a molar that dared misbehave, Edric is reduced to lying in his straw bed, while relatives murmur about whether it's time to fetch the priest or just borrow his shovel. Simple illnesses were so very deadly in early societies because practically everything conspiring against your recovery. Malnutrition, Check. Dirty water? Check. Homes with more rats than rafters? Also a check. And because access to medical care was limited, most folks relied on folk remedies passed down through village gossip and the occasional drunk monk with a recipe book labelled "Hush Now, Don't Ask." From powdered beetles to wine-soaked linen, the line between healing and hilarity grew gloriously blurry. Even when actual physicians were involved, the results could be ambitious. Treatments varied wildly depending on the doctor's mood, enthusiasm, or astrological alignment. Mercury, it might be a cure, or it might be Tuesday. Trepanation, the act of drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure, was surprisingly popular, and, even more surprisingly, sometimes it actually worked, assuming the patient didn't immediately regret the new forehead skylight. But for the most part, the average person confronted illness armed with superstition, stinky tonics, and the moral support of a few well-meaning chickens. It was a time when medicine mostly meant keeping someone company, until either the fever broke or they stopped holding a conversation with the fireplace. And still, people endured. They stitched scraps of insight together with threads of tradition, and through it all, they slept beside the hearth, dreaming of miracles and marginally cleaner spoons. Speaking of dreams, there's a curious path up ahead that winds into the world of wise women and wandering healers. Those mysterious figures who roamed the fringes of society, brewed strange potions, and on occasion got blamed for winter. But for now, tuck your worries under the blanket and settle in as the fire crackles and the breeze hums softly against the shutters. While there are many things to fear in the ancient world, raiders, wild bears, neighbors upset about borrowed goats, it was often the invisible things, the faint coughs and unseen sneezes, that proved the most insidious. Let us now drift softly into the flickering candle glow of a Roman insula, a tall, creaky apartment block where a baker, a philosopher, and an enthusiastic amateur wrestler all shared wafting air and, inevitably, germs. You see, the ancient Romans were marvelous at engineering aqueducts, building roads straighter than a Stoic stair, and inventing things like underfloor heating so they could warm their toes while reading about Caesar's latest conquests. What they weren't quite so proficient at, however, was understanding what made people fall ill. Germs were still enjoying their long run as humanity's greatest invisible celebrities, utterly famous, utterly undetectable. Instead of bacteria, people blamed humours, the four bodily liquids said to govern health: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were ill, you clearly had too much of one, or not enough of another. It was like attempting to fix a clogged pipe by adjusting your horoscope. This brings us to the Roman bathhouses, those steamy social hives buzzing with gossip, strategy, and unfortunately, rampant conjunctivitis. Here, people from all walks of life, senators, soldiers, poets, and pickpockets, soaked together in warm pools, while swapping business tips and microbial souvenirs. To many Romans, these places were seen as havens of cleanliness. To modern microbiologists, they are the historical Petri dishes that nightmares are made of. Yet through all of this, the common cold was, ironically, not considered very common at all. An innocent sniffle lacked the theatrical drama the ancients preferred in their ailments. Plagues were the Broadway musicals of early medicine, full of spectacle, terror, and interpretive moral lessons. Meanwhile, a sore throat simply didn't command attention unless an oracle declared it a symptom delivered by Jupiter himself. Now, if one should fall ill, perhaps you ate some slightly too historical lentils, Or you dined with a philosopher who wouldn't stop quoting Galen until you developed hives. Your treatment options were adventurous. The apothecary might recommend willow bark tea infused with wild optimism, or a charm to be tied around your wrist inscribed with vaguely threatening syllables. Bloodletting was also a national pastime, practiced with leeches or shiny blades, depending on whether you preferred your discomfort slimy or slicey. There was something strangely comforting, though, in the predictability of these methods. Physicians didn't just guess what was wrong, they guessed with great confidence. If your fever didn't break, clearly the gods were annoyed. If your complexion turned green, no need to worry. It was probably green melancholy, a condition Galen once described after, presumably, looking too long at spoiled olives. In the countryside, home remedies flourished with charming absurdity. Some cures involved sniffing garlic until you sneezed out the bad spirits. Others included reciting spells while hopping backward over a fence at dawn. Healing, much like tax collection back then, was as much an art as a science, and frequently misunderstood as both. But we must not mock too much, for despite their mysticism and mushroom-infused methods, these early healers laid an accidental foundation. Their endless note-scribbling, organ-prodding, and occasionally successful guesses would one day lead humanity out of the era where a paper cut could end a saga. Lying now beneath a woolen blanket in a cozy, creaky wood frame house, skies darkened and the smell of beeswax candles curled through cracks in the window. One could imagine a family hurriedly boiling herbs while muttering Latin praises to Hygeia, goddess of health. A mother dabbing a cloth on a warm brow, hoping that chamomile and chants might do what prayers could not. Germs still danced invisibly in the air, whispered like secrets through crowded marketplaces and echoey churches. The world was unknowing but attentive, listening to the body in all its moans and murmurs, hoping for signs, scolding the stars when none came. And somewhere, at that same moment, in another corner of history, a cow sneezed unexpectedly, setting off a chain of events more alarming than any shiver or chill. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another night. Picture, if you will, a peasant in the year 1142. He's named Gregory. Most people are named Gregory, it seems, or Margaret, or old what's-his-face, if you've had enough ale. Gregory has a goat, a thatched roof, and an ever-present stomachache of mysterious origin. He doesn't know what a bacteria is. He only knows that if you sneeze 3 times before breakfast, it's either a bad omen or time to dig the grave, just in case. In early societies, illness was both a mystery and an inconvenience of spectacular proportions. Illness visited like an ungreeted guest and overstayed like a distant cousin who's discovered your pantry. A sniffle could turn into a days-long fever, and a blister could, in due time, become a missing limb. There were no antibiotics, unless you count mouldy bread, administered with divine optimism, or the occasional spirited prayer muttered into the wind while rubbing herbs on your armpits. The thing is, most people had no idea what made them sick. That sort of knowledge huddled somewhere in a forgotten future, deeply misunderstood or entirely non-existent. Instead, explanations ranged from mischievous spirits to celestial misalignments to, oddly, the position of turnips. Yes, in some corners of the world, vegetable orientation carried unusually strong diagnostic value. Imagine your little Gregory again. He's very trusting and prone to mild rashes. And one sunny day you begin to sweat, not from toil or goats or the fear of taxes, though all are likely, just fever sweat. Naturally, A member of your local healing authority, perhaps a woman named Hilda, who's lived to the scandalous age of 41, would be summoned. Hilda would arrive with a woven basket of lumpy roots, oxidized scissors, and a ferret. The ferret might not serve the cure, but he offered companionship, and if we're honest, he knew about as much medicine as Hilda. She might say the sickness is from an imbalance of humours, those ancient fluids believed to slosh about inside you like badly stored soup. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humours were meant to live in harmony, like a medieval boy band. If they got out of sync, well, then you had to bleed the bad vibes out of your system. Hence, the gentle art of leeching. Leeches, you see, were the unsung heroes of ancient academia. A proper physician in the 1300s might receive his education in Latin, theology, and the deeply precise metric system of how many leeches make one person better. The answer was always more leeches, naturally. Now, if you were too poor for leeches, which tragically were not cheap, you might indulge in a therapeutic regimen of garlic poultices, chicken bone charms, or lying perfectly still while a stranger chants over your left elbow. Sufferers were recommended to avoid bathing, which was said to open the pores and let in the bad air, also known as miasma, a sort of invisible health criminal, sneaking around dark alleys and making people wheeze. Soap existed, but it was for the criminally clean. Most people got wet only when rain demanded it. Meanwhile, water sources were enthusiastic carriers of disease, being downstream from everything. One might say the rivers were alive with history. Unfortunately, all of it contagious. And then there was toothache. A humble pain today, but in centuries past, sheer horror. Want relief in 900 AD? You could try a ritual involving a hammered nail and sacred incantations. Or better yet, visit the local blacksmith, who doubled as a dentist one day a month. No anesthetic, just a wooden stick to bite and a whispered prayer you wouldn't meet St. Peter until next Thursday. Ironically, the most well-intentioned remedies often sowed further harm. Doctors, if you were noble enough to afford one, might prescribe treatments such as mercury, which sparkled irresistibly and was absolutely lethal. But it looked medicinal, shimmering like divine approval. It was the glitter glue of ancient pharmaceuticals. Worse yet, illnesses spread in ways people couldn't comprehend. Trade routes brought not only spice and silk, but also sneezes from 4 continents. And cities, bustling with people and rats and everything in between, turned into ideal incubators for diseases that liked a good crowd. As the moon climbed into the quiet sky, it watched over feverish households where mothers whispered lullabies to sweating children, unsure if tomorrow would bring recovery or mourning. In that precarious balance between understanding and confusion, between superstition and science, early societies navigated illness as best they could, armed with herbs, luck, and a profound tolerance for discomfort. But sometimes, occasionally, someone got better, somehow, and their neighbours chalked it up to divine favour, a lucky turnip, or a properly oriented broom. No one knows. Now, sip your imaginary mead, rest your feet beside the whispering hearth, and let us dim the candlelight. Because soon, we'll wander into how people avoided plague even when they didn't quite know what it was, only that it came in with ships, cats, and suspicious smells. In the winding streets of ancient cities, dusty, fragrant with spices, and echoing with the bleats of goats who had far too much opinion, every sneeze was viewed with a peculiar blend of curiosity and mild concern. Walk through Babylon, and a man coughing once might be ignored. cough twice, and suddenly the courtyard empties out like someone shouted "free wine" in the marketplace. Illnesses back then often arrived looking as innocent as a tickle in your throat, then promptly rented out your lungs like an aggressive landlord with no exit policy. Of course, most ancient societies had theories. Some thought sickness was the result of offending a mischievous god. Others assumed it was bad air, hence the word malaria, literally meaning bad air. A poetic mistake, really. Rome believed you could catch a cold from wind that had the audacity to be slightly damp, a concern familiar to at least one grandmother in every culture. But while the gods, the air, and suspicious neighbors were frequently blamed for illness, one common culprit was always there, hiding in plain sight: the water. Oh, water, cool, clear, and utterly treacherous. Consider the public fountains of Rome, masterpieces of aqueduct engineering flowing with water drawn from miles away. Impressive. But despite how refreshing they looked, they were also excellent delivery mechanisms for pathogens, which of course nobody knew because germs were still freeloading anonymously, completely unacknowledged by science or sanitation. So in ancient times, people drank water the same way we sometimes accept all cookies, with blind hope and an uneasy sense of trust. Wells, rivers, and streams, all casually shared with livestock, laundry, and occasionally sacrificial leftovers, became common gathering points for bacteria, which had no name but plenty of enthusiasm. Villagers unknowingly helped them spread, often by dipping their cups in water right after the neighbor's goat had upstream opinions. Still, there were attempts at hygiene. The Egyptians, those linen-loving overachievers, did their best. Not only did they bathe regularly in the Nile, bless them, they even had a god of cleanliness named Nefertum, the ancient world's patron of please wash your hands. Some fashioned rudimentary soap from animal fat and ash, which, while decidedly unluxurious, was better than just rubbing on more dirt and hoping for the best. China, meanwhile, had herbal remedies and a deep respect for balancing internal energy, known as qi, which was wonderful, until someone with a bad cough unbalanced everyone else's qi with alarming efficiency. Healing involved medicinal teas, acupuncture, and good wishes. Admittedly, one of those was more effective than the others, and unfortunately, it was usually the tea. Outside the major civilizations, illness traveled by camel, cart, and occasionally dirty dishware. The idea of quarantine was unfathomable, mostly because no one thought diseases could pass from one person to another. If someone fell sick, most townsfolk either offered soup or hid behind a haystack. There was little middle ground, and so small illnesses went unchecked, a sore throat becoming a festering infection, a simple cut turning the foot into an unrequested chemistry experiment. In societies where leeches were a medical tool and sneezes were interpreted as divine commentary, it's perhaps not surprising that common ailments were given the red carpet treatment by the Grim Reaper. Yet humans persisted, more or less. They prayed. They rubbed crushed garlic on their chests. They sang incantations, concocted potions, and generally treated the body like it was a rather temperamental guest who needed to be coaxed gently back to health with patience, rituals, and the occasional ritual chicken. And somehow, despite it all, despite the microbes marching invisibly through muddy waters and sneeze-filled temples, civilizations held together, stitched with equal parts mythology and muddled medicine. It would be many centuries before someone said aloud, "Have we tried boiling the water?" And equally many before the microscope, that magical device of seeing too much, revealed the enemy all along had been smaller than anyone imagined. except, perhaps, very enthusiastic fleas, but snuggled somewhere between the chaos of coughs and the devised cures of well-meaning herbalists, there's a simple, oddly comforting truth. Humans have always done their best, even if their best involved throwing salt at the sick person and ducking. Now, let's dim the torchlight and prepare to step into the next wonder of the ancient world, where medicine meets morale and the leeches line up with optimism. In the flicker of a firelit hut, thousands of years ago, a particularly unfortunate Sumerian named Eresh stood pondering the mysterious agony vibrating up and down his jaw. It didn't take a trained physician to guess, mostly because trained physicians didn't exist yet, that something was amiss near his molars. His neighbors suspected evil spirits were throwing a tiny riot somewhere beneath his gums, and naturally, someone suggested applying crushed beetles under the tongue. As you do. Eresh, like many of his contemporaries, had wandered into the long and painful saga of dental hygiene, long before it was, well, hygienic. And this is where our sleepy story brings us tonight. Not to the battlefield or the throne room, but to the humble toothache, the tiny rebel that toppled empires, or at very least, ruined a perfectly good barley harvest. You see, for much of ancient history, human teeth were in a fight for their lives. The introduction of agriculture around 10,000 years ago brought with it all sorts of joyous things: steady food supplies, the beginnings of cities, and significantly fewer saber-toothed predators. But it also brought cereal grains, which stuck to teeth like gossip in a village square, where hunter-gatherers once gnawed tough meat and fibrous roots. Early farmers were suddenly chewing on a diet much more likely to rot, both in the pot and in the mouth. Now linger with this image: a Neolithic woman patiently grinding wheat on her stone quern, tiny flecks of rock flaking into her flour, later embedding themselves into her bread. Unknowingly, she had baked herself a dental disaster. By the time she was 25, an age at which you had to start picking out a nice spot for your burial urn, her teeth may have been so worn down from gritty, stone-laced loaves that she chewed as much with her gums as her molars. Tiny infections, introduced through the cracks and pits of worn-out teeth, nested silently. And with no antibiotics to save the day, or even toothbrushes to mount a rescue operation, they burrowed deeper until slumbering within the jaw, like a dragon in its cave. Except instead of breathing fire, it occasionally caused swelling, fever, delirium, and ultimately an impressive funeral. Medical papyri from ancient Egypt, not the bedtime reading of choice, but fascinating nonetheless, list dozens of odd concoctions for dental issues. If you were particularly brave, you might choose a poultice of cumin, frankincense, and, frankly, we're not making this up, donkey fat. One must assume the donkey was less enthused about this therapy than the patient, and yet, despite their best oily efforts, chronic oral infections could spread, turning an abscess into a bloodstream-soaking catastrophe before you could say, perhaps I should rinse with the Nile. Even in ancient Rome, with its engineers, aqueducts, and fondness for bathing, at least sometimes, the problem hadn't improved much. Pliny the Elder, that eternal enthusiastic collector of natural oddities, noted that kissing a mule could cure a toothache. No word on whether that mule had dental insurance. And that, of course, brings us to the crux of the issue. Without anesthesia, without antiseptics, without dental floss, or even guilt-inducing minty mouthwash commercials, a tooth infection wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. A rogue wisdom tooth could gouge open a path for bacteria to waltz into the bloodstream. setting off a full-body fireworks show of fever, swelling, and spectacular internal chaos. Yet what's quietly astonishing is how often people endured all of it. No Novocaine, no soft foods hotline, no emergency dentist glaring at their x-rays. Just grit, occasional prayer, and some exceptionally questionable herbal remedies. Ancient Chinese medical texts, for instance, sometimes prescribed acupuncture or monkey bone soup. One can only hope those were administered separately. So tonight, as you let your heavy eyelids drift toward dreams, consider the humble toothbrush, that long-handled knight of the bathroom sink. Its absence, centuries ago, let tiny invaders sneak past the gates. It wasn't always plague or war that sent someone to a quiet, early grave. Sometimes it was the humblest of hurts, a swollen gum, a lurking molar, a toothache that overstayed its welcome. But we're not quite finished with the body's many creative methods of betraying its owner. In the quiet shadows ahead, another menace is quietly boiling, hidden in a pot of soup. By the flickering lamplight of early civilizations, there were few sentences as quietly terrifying as, "He has a cough." In today's age, you clear your throat awkwardly, and someone offers you lozenges. In ancient Mesopotamia, a persistent cough could earn you a visit with a priest-physician who might try to summon the demon out of your chest using burnt offerings, beer, and possibly some creative guesswork. You see, the ancient world was positively teeming with invisible problems they couldn't name. Germs hadn't gotten their 15 minutes of fame yet, and so the human imagination ran wild. Illness, back then, was often attributed to a mischievous spirit, a vengeful deity, or that suspicious-looking goat your neighbor kept feeding after sunset. People weren't entirely sure, but they were very certain it was someone's fault. Medicine, if we're being generous with the term, was a curious blend of trial, error, and wishful thinking. In Egypt, where physicians were as specialized as a modern-day dermatologist who only treats left elbows, prescriptions for fevers might include incantations, crocodile dung, or a poultice made from mashed figs and old wisdom. People in linen robes murmured words to protect your car, while you tried not to sneeze directly into the ceremonial incense. And yet, behind the strangeness was something oddly endearing. They were trying. Amid all the rituals and resin, the people of early societies earnestly sought to heal one another, even if their tools were made of bronze and their diagnoses were delivered by stargazing or inspecting one's earwax under moonlight. Things were no less alarming in early Europe. Picture a medieval peasant waking up with a sore throat. If he was lucky, the village wise woman might recommend garlic steeped in wine. Not the worst way to start the day. If he was less lucky, he might be told to wear a pigeon carcass around his neck to draw out the illness. The question was not so much, does this work, as, is this the least bad option I have? The real deadliness of these simple ailments lay not just in their misunderstood nature, but in their quiet persistence. A toothache untreated could swell into a festering abscess that led to sepsis. A scraped knee could invite a microscopic intruder to throw a full-body party. There were no antibiotics, no germ theory, and no sterile gauze, just grit, herbs, and a great deal of hope. Without understanding bacteria, societies relied on symbolism and environment. Illness came from bad smells, stagnant air, or an imbalance of humors, hot, cold, wet, and dry. If a fever plagued you, they might bleed you to release the heat, or bathe you in cold water infused with rose petals and highly speculative science. Let's not forget the public health infrastructure, elegantly described by historians as We meant well. Sanitation was experimental at best. Waste disposal often involved tossing things into the street and letting fate, or perhaps the neighbor's goats, handle it. Water sources were shared by livestock and laundry alike, and communal bathhouses, well-intentioned though they were, also doubled as cheerful, breeding grounds for every malady passing through town. But still, something quietly marvelous was unfolding in this muddle. Slowly, patterns emerged. Someone noticed that wounds fared better when cleaned, that too much bloodletting led to fewer patient complaints, mostly because the patient had stopped being upright. Midwives passed down knowledge through whispered instruction and stained fingers. Traders unwittingly shared herbal treatments across continents. In their puzzled stumbles and second-hand remedies, early people were unknowingly sketching the earliest outlines of modern medicine. Of course, it was all still hopelessly fragile. A simple cold in the wrong season might knock out a quarter of a village. Children were especially vulnerable, their immune systems like open windows to the smallest biological breezes. And the elderly, softened by decades and hard winters, often fell to infections a spoonful of amoxicillin could swat away today. Even so, there is something quietly heroic about them. Draped in wool, muttering incantations, clutching dried herbs as courageously as any scalpel. They fought their tiny, invisible battles without microscopes, without certainty, but with a stubborn sort of love. As evening settled over their thatched roofs and smoky hearths, people gathered around fires to share remedies, stories, and theories about stars and phlegm. The world was dangerous, and disease was ever lurking, but even in the flicker of ignorance, there was warmth. Humanity, after all, doesn't need perfect knowledge to offer care. Just enough light to warm the night. And just beyond the warmth of the firelight, something else brewed. Not an illness this time, but an idea that unseen causes could be understood, that there was more to healing than charms and cheerful pigeons. The dawn of curiosity was coming. The age of accidental medicine was about to get a bit less accidental. A gentle breeze rustles the walls of a Roman, insular, those cheerfully overcrowded apartment blocks, carefully stacked like pancakes by anxious architects who clearly hadn't met gravity. Inside one cramped room, a humble cobbler is coughing. It's the kind of cough that modern ears would immediately peg as a mild cold. Something treatable with a warm cup of lemon tea, a blanket, and unreasonable amounts of television. But not in ancient Rome. No. In those days, a tickle in the throat could turn Tuesday into the end of an era. You see, the ancient world had an absolutely charming tendency to meet ordinary microbes with maximum confusion. A sore throat might be credited to bad air, or an imbalance of humours. Yes, humours. Those imaginary bodily fluids that medieval doctors took very seriously. According to Galen, the Beyoncé of ancient medicine, your health depended on a finely tuned blend of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The world's worst artisanal smoothie. Our cobbler, poor soul, has been told by a street physician, or more likely, a neighbour who once met a street physician, that his cough is a sign of excess phlegm. The solution? Eat boiled leeks, avoid figs, and lie very still while avoiding strong emotions. Sneezing, in this case, would be entirely unsportsmanlike. Now, to the untrained eye, this may look like medieval guesswork, but there's undeniable beauty in how sincere and inventive these routines were. People genuinely tried to understand what was happening inside their bodies in a time when dissecting one was considered both impolite and illegal, unless you had a royal pardon or a very quiet night shift. Stroll slightly westward on our sleepy mind map, and you'll find yourself in early Anglo-Saxon England, where illness was sometimes thought to be a result of elf shot. Yes, elf shot, a perfectly reasonable diagnosis, where invisible arrows from mischievous woodland spirits caused pain and fever. Unsurprisingly, herbs and incantations were the go-to remedies. You'd wrap the patient in 9 kinds of woodland leaves, mumble a few riddles about Odin, and pray really, really hard. Modern pharmaceuticals. Sorry, this prescription is covered by local druids. Meanwhile, across the ocean, indigenous American societies often attributed sickness to spiritual imbalances or the breach of powerful taboos. But unlike their European counterparts, many of these healers had a staggeringly astute knowledge of medicinal plants. They may not have known what a virus was, but they had figured out treatments for fever, inflammation, even antiseptics, long before your average European leech wrangler ever considered washing their hands. Hand washing, incidentally, is a modern solution to an ancient oversight. For most of history, cleanliness was symbolic rather than sanitary. Bathing removed not germs, but sin, which is lovely for the soul, less so for the immune system. Surgeons, for example, routinely went from sawing off a gangrenous limb to delivering a baby with the same set of unwashed tools, perhaps pausing only to wipe their hands on whatever curtain passed for clothing. Part of the reason simple illness was so lethal then is that people weren't fighting germs. They were negotiating with spirits, balancing their bodily fluids, or appeasing cranky Roman household gods. The concept of contagion took a notoriously long time to settle in. Even as late as the 18th century, many physicians continued to think that wasting diseases like tuberculosis were caused by melancholy, damp mattresses, or an excess of poetry. It's difficult not to feel affection for these ancient attempts at healing, strange as they were. There's a fragile hope in all those herbal teas, chants, and carefully arranged leech jars. A nap might have been just as effective, of course, but it's much more comforting to tell yourself you've outsmarted the plague with a warm onion and the blessing of Mars. And while hindsight makes much of this sound like a comedy of errors, these missteps were steps nonetheless. Slow, stumbling progress in the dark corridors of medical understanding. As our cobbler drifts back into a restless slumber, warmed by a fire of questionable safety and the fumes of medicinal garlic, the city sleeps on. And in every street corner, behind every shuttered tavern, lie dreams not only of health, but of those mysterious forces that seem to govern whether a man survives the sniffles or not. The night deepens gently, and our journey continues softly into the damp recesses where medicine met miracle, and monasteries kept more than just prayers tucked between their pages. Imagine, if you will, drifting through the cobbled alleyways of a medieval city, not the picturesque candlelit ones you see in movies, but the ones where questionable puddles glisten and the aroma is an aromatic blend of horse, dampness, and, well, civilization without plumbing. It is in this fragrant atmosphere that we find our next culprit in history's long list of simple illnesses gone spectacularly wrong: the humble city street. You see, in early societies, illness didn't just waltz through the front door. Sometimes it was invited in with a festive parade of rats, fleas, and suspiciously murky water. Streets weren't so much thoroughfares as they were open-air petri dishes, seasoned daily with waste, curiosity, and periodic goat traffic. Let's take a particular stroll through 14th century Paris, a city full of grandeur, poetry, and at least one person shouting, "A chamber pot above," before dumping yesterday's dinner digestion out the window. Sidewalks were optional. Hygiene was spiritual, rather than practical. And puddles were not things you stepped in lightly, not unless you'd made peace with your maker or had very sturdy boots. It wasn't just the city streets themselves, though they were doing their best to support microbial life in every crevice. It was the general concept of waste, disposal. Before people understood germ theory, they had theories of their own. The leading idea was miasma, or bad air. Illness, they believed, floated in invisible stink clouds, like malevolent perfume. Take a whiff of particularly foul air, and boom, your humours are out of balance, your liver is cross, and someone's fetching a priest. Naturally, to control disease, authorities focused on moving smells around. Doctors prescribed aromatic herbs, incense, and even burning tar in the streets. If it smelled nice, or at least differently bad, that was considered progress. Nobody, however, thought to ask whether there might be something in the waste itself. But then again, who could blame them? The technology of the day did not include microscopes or hand sanitizer. It involved a broom, a bucket, and occasionally a man named Pierre, who specialized in shouting "make way" before launching contents off a balcony. And yet, for all this chaos, people lived as best they could. There were routines, morning prayers, midday bread, evening songs, and a general knowledge that if you lived in the big city, your chances of catching something were greatly enhanced by your proximity to the public latrines, or as I like to call them, plague-flavoured cafes. Interestingly, monks and nuns, those paragons of piety and soup-making, often fared better in times of illness. Why? Not because of divine favour necessarily, but rather because monasteries tended to be cleaner. They washed their hands more regularly as part of ritual purity, and they had access to herbal remedies, though results varied depending on whether you'd secured the right leaves or just something the local hedgehog had chewed on. Even water, blessed and bubbly as it may seem to us now, was suspicious back then. Drinking water raw, as in straight from a river, where both bathing and laundry happened, invited all manner of microscopic guests. Wine and ale, being boiled in the brewing process, were ironically safer. Imagine that, ordering a pint because it's safer than a glass of water. We may owe more to historical brewers than we'll ever give them credit for. And so a child might get a simple stomach bug, nothing threatening by modern standards. But in a home without a bathroom, tools, or understanding of what caused illness, that bug could spiral into dehydration, infection, and with heartbreaking frequency, an early funeral escorted by coughing neighbours and chanting clergy. Still, humans adjusted somehow. They built hospitals, although hospital was sometimes just a glorified barn with a saint's portrait and 2 beds. They trained barber surgeons who could remove your tooth, shave your beard, and maybe your spleen, all before lunch. And they wrote long, winding medical texts, blending astrology, poetry, and whatever Aristotle had passed along 8 centuries earlier. Progress was uneven, results were inconsistent, but people kept trying, because for millennia, that is the real secret. They didn't know what they didn't know, and yet they never stopped looking for answers. As the stars rise higher above our muddy avenues and flickering torches of old Europe, let's wander next toward the quiet chambers of the ancient healers, where doctor was a title, a guess, and occasionally a man with a stick full of herbs. Picture a quiet village. Slate-grey cottages hug a winding dirt road like children curled up for a nap. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys. The smell of barley broth and damp wool clings to the air. Somewhere nearby, an unfortunate farmer sneezes. That single sneeze, back in the 14th century could have been the opening act of an entire village tragedy. Because if you caught a sniffle in the Middle Ages, well, bless you, and may God bless the local barber who's about to remove some of your blood in hopes of evicting an imaginary toxin. You see, the medieval world, and honestly, much of the ancient one, too, was bustling with theories, very few of them correct, about what actually made people sick. The prevailing idea was balance. The balance of what, you ask? The four humours, like the Beatles, but squishier and not as musically gifted. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were thought to slosh around in your body like roommates with very strong opinions. If you got ill, it wasn't because of bacteria or viruses. Those hadn't yet made their big public debut. But because your inner soup of humours had gone rogue. Too much phlegm. You're sluggish and chill. Too much black bile. Melancholy. Too much yellow bile. Angry. Too much blood. You're unnecessarily cheerful, and obviously something should be done about that. Thus, the barber surgeon would arrive, looking every bit like a man who cuts hair and performs minor amputations. He'd apply a cheerful leech, or cut a vein open to drain your excess joy. If you were lucky, you'd survive. Slightly paler, but always better balanced. This delicate concept of balance also extended to diet. Cucumbers, cool and moist. Lamb, hot and dry. Wine, hot and moist. And so, your neighbourhood physician, who probably hadn't touched a patient in decades, might advise you to eat pears to counteract your cold melancholy, assuming the pears weren't already fermenting under a bed of straw in someone's cellar. It's worth noting that doctors were mainly for the wealthy. The average peasant had limited options for healing, and many of those involved prayers, charms, and possibly rubbing a chicken on the afflicted area. Chickens were the unsung Swiss army knives of medieval medicine. Rubbing, warding off demons, and dinner, all in one feathery package. But despite their best efforts, early societies had a whopping weakness. They lacked microscopes. Germs, those invisible invaders that would one day crawl into drawings under a frowning scientist's quill, were simply not part of the conversation. Illness came from bad air, or miasma, as it was grandly called. Bad smells weren't just unpleasant, they were dangerous. A ripe summer latrine or a malodorous swamp was seen as a direct highway for illness to enter your body and throw your humours into a frenzy. The bubonic plague, clearly a case of deeply offensive vapours, or perhaps God expressing his displeasure. He was quite the critic. Some physicians did try more, let's say imaginative approaches. One such enthusiastic soul recommended stuffing your nose with flowers to prevent disease. This became the precursor to the iconic plague doctor mask centuries later. A beak full of herbs and spices, essentially turning every physician into a walking potpourri duck. Town hygiene, too, was optimistic at best. Chamber pots were emptied onto streets with a cheerful "look out below," and people trudged through these fragrant rivers with an inexplicable tolerance. Shoes were less a barrier to dirt than a suggestion that perhaps you weren't barefoot. In such conditions, even a small wound could turn into a grand epic of oozing infection. A scraped knee from falling in the goose muck might lead to gangrene. And the treatment for that usually involved a hot iron, a hasty prayer, and a friend with a strong stomach. In all fairness, healing wasn't always an uphill mudslide. Monastic hospitals, run by pious and sleep-deprived monks, did offer surprisingly compassionate care, even if the treatments leaned toward the prayerful side. They bathed patients, kept records, and crucially, kept the rats away. Sometimes that was enough. And yet, for all their efforts, people still died of colds, or what we now call a cold. Back then, it could become pneumonia, or trigger fever, or led to a cascading orchestra of infections. Antibiotics hadn't arrived to rescue the day. Penicillin was still snoozing quietly inside some humble mold, awaiting its discovery centuries later. Somehow, despite all this, people lived. They danced, they farmed, they fell in love and sang songs that got stuck in their heads for days. Humans, in general, are astonishingly good at making life out of chaos and scratching joy out of dry earth. And so, our sleepy journey continues as we drift ever deeper into this peculiar history of sniffles with suspicious outcomes. Roaming through the mists of early civilization, we come now to the mighty marketplace, the lively, cacophonous center of trade, chatter, and, depending on who had a bit too much ancient cheese, contagious coughing. In ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, marketplaces weren't just for bargaining over lentils and sheep teeth. Yes, that was once currency. But they also played a starring role in the great travelling theatre of germs. Picture it, sun-baked streets filled with merchants shouting prices, children darting between amphorae, and behind every olive jar lurks an invisible hitchhiker, bacteria. You see, in bustling early settlements, people clustered together like overly affectionate sardines. Cities like Uruk or later Alexandria became dense networks of close-quartered humans sharing everything. Genes, gossip, and gastrointestinal distress. All it took was one particularly bold case of dysentery to sweep through a neighborhood like a very impolite party guest who refuses to leave. Now, keep in mind, most people back then had only a whisper of an idea of what illness really was. Bad air, angry gods, sitting on cold stones. Personally, I take bad air over Zeus is furious at your cousin's goat sacrifice any day. But whatever the diagnosis, they rarely suspected the absurdly small culprits behind their suffering, the microbes. Imagine throwing entire rituals, consulting oracles, or sacrificing livestock just to cure what we now know to be a particularly unruly sneeze. And sanitation. Oh, that was a complex affair. The Romans, those shimmering inventors of aqueducts and marble, statues of everything, actually made some strides with public toilets and baths. But even then, many of their bathhouses doubled as both health centers and, microbial buffet lines. While the baths themselves were warm and relaxing, which you must admit is delightful, the occasional laceration or pimple could mix with the water like herbal tea, just far less therapeutic. Outside the elite cities, things were muddier, literally. In village settings, livestock and humans often lived within the same shared walls. Practical for warmth, yes, but a dream scenario for a virus-craving cross-species networking opportunities. Picture an early medieval peasant waking up cheek to cheek with a chicken, a pig, and a persistent cough. Not exactly a spa retreat. Wounds, infections, and occasional mysterious fevers were accepted as just part of life. Like the weather, or taxes, if taxes came with pus. Treatments ranged from cover it with honey to let's make a hole in your head to let out the bad spirits. Called trepanation, that last one was a real thing. They literally carved holes into skulls. And here you thought your last checkup was unpleasant, and there was little to no isolation. In early dwellings, small huts, tents, yurts, when someone got ill, there was no guest room to shuffle them into. No quarantine hut with scented hay and optional room service. They stayed right there, breathing all over their kin, swapping spoons and sleeping side by side with whoever wasn't too sick to fetch water. Before long, everyone was enjoying the same seasonal plague as a family bonding activity. But perhaps most fatal of all was what we might call the enthusiastic application of old wives' tales. Remedies that were passed down not for their effectiveness, but for their dramatic flair. Rub rooster fat on your chest. Swallow 7 black beetles whole. Stand beneath the full moon and sneeze 3 times facing north. Admittedly charming imagery, less so for your liver. And yet, with so many perils sniffing around every corner, from shared chalices to anthill poultices, humans kept on thriving, building, raising little snot-nosed empires that would eventually invent microscopes and soap. But those were centuries away, and for now, people put their trust in herbal tea, divine favors, and the occasional strongly worded prayer. So as the cough of history echoes softly along a tapestry of cobbled streets and communal sickness, it lulls us gently into the warm realization that while your neighbor's sniffles may still be annoying, at least they're not being treated with leeches and a chant. Let's just say, the journey to understanding illness had a lot of interesting detours. In our next quiet wander, we'll drift into the mysterious world of bodily balances, where phlegm was a big deal, and your mood depended on your spleen's sense of humor. Somewhere between the clang of a medieval bell and the whiff of questionable stew drifting through a cobbled alley, a man in a woolen tunic coughs once, then twice, then dramatically clutches his chest and lies down to contemplate the meaning of life. Or lunch. He doesn't know it yet, but he's just lost the eternal battle against the common cold. Welcome to early societies, where the sniffles weren't just an inconvenience, they were a spectator sport. Viruses had no antibiotics to fear, and our ancestors had about as much understanding of contagion as a goat has of algebra, which explains in part why even minor illnesses could become major theatrical events. So let's dim the torchlight and peer with quiet curiosity into the curious world of ancient beliefs about illness. Picture this. It's a quiet evening in ancient Mesopotamia. The ziggurats are humming with the vague threat of divine judgment, and little Enkidu has a fever. What does his family do? They don't reach for a thermometer. They summon the local priest-exorcist. Because naturally, the first assumption when someone has a sore throat is that a particularly petty demon has moved in. For thousands of years, sickness wasn't an internal malfunction. It was social commentary from the gods, or perhaps angry ancestors throwing shade from the afterlife. In some cases, both. If you had a rash, it might be because you looked at the wrong star at the wrong moment. If you sneezed without a blessing, it could open a spiritual wormhole that let in otherworldly mischief. Frankly, existing was a high-risk activity. In ancient Egypt, an astonishingly advanced medical tradition bloomed. Alongside generous dosages of magical spells, divine ointments, and crocodile dung. Their medical papyri list hundreds of remedies, many of which read like ingredients for a witch's brunch. One delightful preparation involved lizard blood, honey, and the milk of a woman who had birthed a son. Prescribed for, among other things, diseases caused by evil winds, which, while poetic, may actually have just meant bad smells, or your uncle's breath. Over in Greece, things grew marginally more scientific, as long as you could survive the lectures. Hippocrates, whose name you've probably heard spoken in hospital hallways with a side of Latin, proposed the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An elegant theory, if you ignore the fact that it led to centuries of aggressive vomiting and the enthusiastic application of leeches. feeling tired. Clearly your black bile is out of sync. Feeling gassy, too much yellow bile. Basically, your internal health was modeled like a medieval paint palette, and balance was everything. But however nuanced or not these theories were, they all shared one critical flaw. They didn't understand germs. Germs, those sneaky microscopic ruffians, would not be discovered until the 17th century, and not fully accepted until the 19th. So until then, people were left battling invisible enemies with cabbage poultices and staring contests with the heavens. Consider also the sanitation, or glorious lack thereof. In most early settlements, water for drinking, bathing, and occasionally goat washing came from the same source. That source, one might add, was often downhill from the toilet zone. A sewage scenario so delightfully doomed that even thinking about it could make your stomach humble. And yet, people wandered barefoot through alleyways where bacteria held raves at every puddle. And so, when little tragedies struck, a child with a fever, a mother laid low with a cough, or a soldier who found himself unpredictably oozing, these incidents often spiraled into crisis, not because the illnesses were mighty, but because the odds were already stacked against survival. Your small infection didn't just battle your immune system, it battled superstition, misinformation, and the occasional enema involving honey and crushed beetles. Even the mighty Roman Empire, with its aqueducts and bathhouses, never fully conquered the subtle treachery of microbes. They did, however, invent an early version of eye drops made of roasted mouse brain juice, which is medically useless, but truly unforgettable. So while today you might press a button and have ibuprofen delivered to your doorstep by a suspiciously cheerful drone, imagine instead a world where every sneeze was a celestial riddle, every wheeze a probable hex, and every remedy a dabble in herbal roulette. It was an era where belief was medicine, and medicine was frankly bananas. And as the candle of this chapter flickers low, let us step quietly past the linen-curtained sickbeds and the chanting healers and peer ahead, where collective understanding begins to shift, not toward perfect cures, but toward curiosity, experimentation, and yes, a bit less lizard blood. Just beyond, we'll hear the early whispers of treatments moving from temples to tables lined with dusty books and sharp quills. By the flickering firelight of history, let us now creep gently into the strange and sneeze-filled world of ancient medicinal philosophy, where fates were decided by flowers, fermented liquids, and some rather judgmental birds. You see, long before people had microscopes or thermometers, or dared to ask politely if anyone had washed their hands, medicine was less a science and more a kind of feverish guessing game. And in that hazy swirl of herbs and hope, one thing became increasingly obvious. When you don't know what's causing disease, you can end up trying absolutely everything, sometimes all at once. Take, for instance, the somewhat unsettling ancient Egyptian remedy for a cough, which included dates, honey, and, I do apologize, woodlouse. Yes, those little armored bugs that curl up when startled. Somehow, squishing them into a paste and stirring them into honey seemed like a plan to someone. The idea may have been that the bug's natural, roll and hide tactic could be metaphorically applied to the illness. Or perhaps they just ran out of licorice root. But not all ancient healers relied on buggy syrups and divine guesswork. Greek physicians, such as the famed Hippocrates, the fellow modern doctors swear by in oath but rarely consult for recipes, began to break with myth-based medicine. He proposed that disease came from within the body and was tied to the balance of four charmingly vague fluids, or humours, blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm. These were believed to govern your health, your mood, and whether you'd be allowed to skip temple duties for the day. Too much black bile. You were melancholic and probably in need of a good bleeding. An excess of yellow bile. Congratulations, you were angry. And also probably in need of a good bleeding. Bloodletting, you see, was the one-size-fits-all marvel of ancient care. It was thought that draining blood could reduce fever, stabilize mood, and treat just about anything short of a broken amphora. Did your head hurt? Out with the blood? Indigestion? That's clearly a surplus of sanguine cheer. Let's fix that with a blade and a bowl. The Romans, inspired by their increasingly well-organized plumbing systems, also loved a good purge. They introduced enemas and steam rooms into their medical arsenal in case the illness was simply hiding deep inside and needed to be steamed or flushed out of its hiding spot. But we should lightly tiptoe over to the more magical corners of the world, where diseases were still seen as spiritual invaders. In early Mesopotamian society, many believed that illnesses were a form of divine punishment, often sent by gods who were, it seems, quite particular. If you offended a deity by stepping on sacred soil, misplacing an idol, or just existing too confidently, you might come down with a seasonal bout of divine wrath, which conveniently resembled a chest infection. As such, healing often meant not just balancing bodily fluids, but also appeasing the heavens. Priests would chant elaborate incantations, burn fragrant resins, and occasionally bury offerings, including, regrettably, other small animals, to mollify the invisible forces at play. This may sound strange to us, but in a way, it was oddly thorough. They were treating both the physical and metaphysical, casting a wide net in hopes that something somewhere would work. And then there were medieval Europeans, those candle-lit worrywarts who decided that no problem was so grave that it couldn't be treated with a combination of herbs, amulets, and terrifying diagrams of the zodiac. Illness, they believed, had everything to do with the position of the moon, your date of birth, and the somewhat arbitrary shape of your skull. Surgeons consulted star charts before operating, which would be a quaintly poetic approach, had it not been paired with bone saws often dipped in whatever liquid was closest, wine, vinegar, or possibly ink. None of this, of course, emerged from malice. In a world without science, everything is a sort of poetry. The body, the soul, the stars above, they all dance together in a mysterious, if often messy, duet. A sneeze could mean you were catching a cold, or that you'd upset the god of hedgerows. And while much of this medical artistry was misinformed by our standards, occasionally absurd, frequently ineffective, and often a little bitey, it was born of earnest attempts to understand the ever-confusing human form. They were feeling around in the dark, armed only with garlic, patience, and a flute made from a sheep's femur. Eventually, of course, light would begin to reach that darkness. Slowly, gently, through blood-stained bandages and herbal steam, a clearer picture would begin to take shape, as curious minds dared to peer through glass. In time, they would discover what had lain hidden in plain sight. Tiny, invisible culprits. And all the wood, lice in honey, would give way to something far stranger, and so much more illuminating. But that's a tale best told through the lens of someone brave enough to stare a germ in the face, with one eye closed and a microscope just barely invented. In the flickering lamplight of medieval Europe, nothing said impending doom, quite like the sight of a barber sharpening his blade. Today, we'd consider a barber's offer to both trim your beard and drain your veins as a bit of an overstep in services. But back then, the bright red and white poles outside their shops weren't just decorative. They were more like a menu. Red for bloodletting, white for bandages, and a healthy dose of overconfidence mixed in. Yes, long before proper medicine had its day in the nearly sanitary sun, the lines between healing arts and hopeful butchery were, let's say, fuzzy. But the barbers were just part of a much larger cast of characters in the ancient play of healthcare. Among them, the pious, monks, the village midwives with suspiciously heretical herb knowledge, and your occasionally helpful neighbour, Ethel, who swore by heated goose fat for everything from a cough to a broken heart. In that world, understanding how the body worked relied more on philosophy than on, say, dissection. That would have been rude and illegal. The reigning theory for centuries came from Galen, a Greek physician whose medical ideas stuck around like an unwelcome houseguest for about 1 to 300 years. Galen believed in the four humours: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm and blood. If this sounds more like a medieval stew recipe than a framework for health, you'd be correct on both counts. Doctors sought to balance these humours with everything from diet and astrology to leeches and occasionally yelling. Take a fever, for instance. Today, we see it as the body fighting infection. Back then, it meant your humours were having a rather rowdy disagreement, and likely someone had taken in too much heat or some suspiciously lunar cheese. The solution, obviously, was to let some blood out and perhaps apply a compress of crushed violets and vinegar, or pigeon droppings, depends on the century. Even the concept of germs was still centuries from crashing the party. The idea that invisible critters could spoil our health would have sounded absurd, somewhere between sorcery and an especially rude accusation. Instead, sickness was often blamed on miasma, a sort of sinister fog that loitered in low places and dark alleys. People hung posies near their faces, covered their noses with cloves, and lit incense, not for good vibes, but to defend against these evil vapours. It's the origin of that whimsical nursery rhyme about the plague, which children still chant gleefully without realising it's about mass coughing and existential dread. Nowhere was this misunderstanding more vast than in dealing with simple injuries. A scrape on the knee, that could earn you a cross and a sermon. A deep cut, let's cauterize that with a glowing iron poker, just to be safe. And by safe, we mean very painful. The real danger, though, came later. There was no knowledge of antiseptics, so a little dirt in a wound could invite bacteria to throw a full banquet in your bloodstream. And thus, a stumble in a field became a one-way ticket to an early grave. But perhaps most precarious were the childbirths. Ah yes, childbirth. That grand and terrifying rite of passage where squealing infants entered a precarious world, with slightly better odds than their mothers. In some towns, midwives were revered, wielding knowledge passed down through generations. In others, they were watched carefully by religious authorities, lest their knowledge stray into territory considered inconvenient. It was a high-stakes affair, often accompanied by whispered prayers, tightly gripped hands, and the looming fear of infection, blood loss, or childbed fever, a term that sounds tender, but was anything but. And yet, against this backdrop of rather grim guesswork, people got creative. Pounded herbs and honey mixtures were passed along like sacred heirlooms. Spells, chants, and protective charms were standard prescription fare. A concoction of wormwood might be taken on a full moon to cure melancholy, or simply as an excuse to gather the village gossip under the guise of medicine. Still, as night falls gently and the flickering torches grow dim, there is something touching about their determined fumbling. In a world where so much was unknown, they tried, even if their methods were occasionally feral. And so, with the scent of rosemary hailed as a medicinal miracle and an alarming number of leeches still unaccounted for, we begin to drift toward quieter halls and dimmer lamps, curling into the next strand of forgotten remedies. As the candlelight flickered over the stone walls of a medieval apothecary, it revealed rows of dusty glass bottles with names like Dragon's Blood, Witch's Butter, and the ever-helpful Powder of Sympathy. The aroma? A piquant bouquet of dried herbs, old leather, and something suspiciously similar to goat. Despite what the enthusiastic labeling might suggest, none of these curious concoctions were winning any awards for effectiveness. The average person of the Middle Ages stood a better chance praying over a bowl of broth than trusting the local healer to sort out a bothersome cough. And this is where our story gets wonderfully strange and just a little sneezy. See, the connection between symptom and source was, let's say, flexible in those days. If your chest hurt, it might be the damp weather, or an imbalance of the four humours, or perhaps Mercury was in retrograde and had taken your lungs with it. Diagnosis came from a trio of trusted sources: stars, stools, and superstition. Medicine wasn't so much science back then, as it was a whimsical mix of astrology, folklore, and animal parts boiled hopefully. A headache, for example, might be treated with trepanation, an elegant term for boring a small hole into your skull to let the bad spirits out. Convenient if you happen to have a spoon and questionable decision-making skills. The theory wasn't entirely absurd in their eyes. After all, if you're already hearing the whispers of doom behind your eyeballs, maybe the evil spirits really do need an exit strategy. And let's talk about leeches. Nothing says medieval healthcare professional quite like holding a squirming tube of future anemia. Bloodletting wasn't just a treatment, it was the treatment. Too hot? Let some blood out. Too cold? More blood out. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it. Less blood, more balance. The belief was that all illness stemmed from an imbalance of the four bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Makes you appreciate the simplicity of taking a vitamin C tablet, doesn't it? Meanwhile, in more urban centres, barber surgeons were giving it their best shot, literally. These jacks of all painful trades could pull a tooth, lance a boil, and give you a lovely haircut before retiring into the night. Their shops were marked by striped poles that looked suspiciously like candy canes, except they represented blood and bandages, not peppermint cheer, and they were considered respectable, because in a world without anesthesia, being quick with a blade was the finest qualification one could have. Now, for those of greater means, nobles clutching scented handkerchiefs and a fondness for Latin. There were university-educated physicians who insisted that if you read enough Galen, everything would make perfect sense. They would ponder a diagnosis for several solemn hours, scribble something illegible on a scrap of parchment, and recommend a syrup of something obscure like boiled pearl or unicorn horn shavings. Of course, none of this worked, but how elegantly it failed. And there lies the quiet tragedy beneath the charm of it all. For every talisman worn to ward off whispers of plague, there was a real child fevered with infection, a mother weakened after childbirth, a young apprentice whose minor scratch spiraled into fevered oblivion. The world didn't lack ingenuity or heart. It simply lacked microscopes and antibiotics. though perhaps, under layers of strange customs and cheerful guesswork, humanity was inching toward understanding, slowly and often very sleepily. What is strangely comforting is the tenacity with which people tried. They built herb gardens and copied manuscripts by candlelight. They listened to the moon and the murmurs of old bones. They wanted to know what made people well. It would be centuries before germ theory arrived to blow the doors off the invisible world of infection. But until then, the balm was belief, which, while powerless against sepsis, could be quite potent against despair. And so, nestled in the scent of rosemary and regret, the ancient world of early remedies rests like a tired patient wrapped in wool. Somewhere in those jars and scrolls lies the first flicker of modern medicine. A rough beginning, yes, but one that toddled forward on the earnest feet of hope. Now, drift softly to a place where ships are beginning to sail, not just for spices and silk, but eventually for strange new substances that might, just might, keep infections at bay. By the time we arrive at the Middle Ages, medicine has officially entered the era of "let's try this and see what happens," a charming phrase history buffs know as the early experimental period, and everyone else might know by its more accurate name. Absolutely, please don't do that. Imagine the scene. It's a moonlit evening in a medieval village. Owls hoot. A cow sighs gently. Somewhere, a blacksmith snores like a bag of gravel in a washing machine. And in a cottage not far off, a woman sits beside her child, who's running a fever from a simple infection, a sore throat perhaps, or an earache gone rogue. In today's world, a week of antibiotics and some ginger tea would clear things right up. But in the year 1147, things aren't quite so simple. "Fetch the onions," someone cries. That someone is probably the village healer. Not quite a doctor, but a deeply confident enthusiast, armed with a sack of garlic cloves, a raven feather, a suspicious poultice, and no formal education. She believes in the power of balance, of humours that is. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, the four squishy pillars of pre-modern wellness. If you're shivering, the healer may believe you've got too much phlegm, or not enough blood, or an imbalance in your inner bile compass. The answer? Bleeding, obviously. They'd nick your arm to let a little bad blood escape and hopefully take your fever with it. If that didn't work, they might have tried blowing warm herbs into your nostrils or placing a pigeon, yes the bird, on your belly for mystical absorption reasons. And strangely, sometimes people did get better. But that had less to do with the pigeon and more with the human body casually being good at surviving, if not actively sabotaged by your treatment. Now, medieval towns weren't exactly paragons of cleanliness. Streets doubled as open sewers, rats were uninvited landlords with no leases, and water came from wells that may or may not have been next to the tannery. This meant that even the lightest scratch could turn septic faster than you could say, "I think this looks worse than yesterday." Combine that with poor nutrition, because few diets based on turnips and eternal gruel are known for their immune-boosting prowess, and it's easy to see why colds and flus could become full-blown medieval tragedies. Without vitamins, your body's defenses are like a castle with no moat, no archers, and not even a sternly worded sign. But not all was ignorance. In scattered corners of the world, medical texts bubbled up with brilliance. The Islamic Golden Age saw physicians like Avicenna writing detailed medical encyclopedias with surgical instruments, quarantine descriptions, and methods of diagnosing illness that weren't just stick your head in a bucket of eels and see how you feel. Sadly, this knowledge had a hard time travelling west during the Middle Ages. Much of Europe was still stuck poking bruises with holy relics and recommending prayer schedules as treatment plans, with optional blessed chicken parts. Hospitals, where they existed, were less doctors' offices and more spiritual guest houses. Monks ran them, and their main prescription was persistence. Patients were tended to with a blend of gentle hymns, herbal teas, and the cosmic power of hope. Not ineffective in spirit, but tragically lacking in penicillin. One curious practice was the urine check, an honourable attempt to diagnose illnesses via the colour, thickness, and, sometimes, flavour of your urine. It may sound unpleasant, but to be fair, many people today still obsess over their pee's colour like it's a mood ring. Some things endure. Meanwhile, the concept of germs, those invisible mischief makers, was a long, long way from being discovered. So when diseases whipped through towns, no one thought to wash hands or isolate the sick. Instead, they blamed the stars. Maybe Jupiter was in retrograde, or Mercury was having a sulk again. In any case, many physicians worked more like astrologers with scalpels, and yet, humanity carried on. Children still played in meadows, lovers still exchanged poorly spelled sonnets, and despite having no antibacterial soap or sensible footwear, people kept waking up trying to be just a little less unwell today than yesterday. Which brings us, quietly, to a most curious gentleman in centuries to come. A man who would sniff cowpox blisters for scientific insight, all in pursuit of stopping disease in its tracks. But we'll take that journey through oddly inoculated farms in just a moment, in the flickering candlelight of a 12th century infirmary, which, under scrutiny, was really just a chilly stone room that smelled abundantly of damp linen and wishful thinking. A monk named Brother Alfric applied a compress of mashed onions and goose grease to a nobleman's forehead. The nobleman, unfortunately, was suffering from what modern medicine would call a bit of a sniffle. But in his day and age, it was flirting with existential catastrophe. Illness in early societies had a dramatic flair, often turning the common cold into a script for a medieval tragedy. And at the centre of this theatrical performance were the physicians, or more accurately, philosophers in robes who had recently read Galen between sips of suspicious wine. You see, medicine in many early societies wasn't entirely focused on recovery. It was deeply entwined with balancing invisible fluids through methods that can only be described as optimistic guesswork. The theory of the four humours ruled the medical stage like a particularly persistent theatre troupe. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Elements that sounded less like a healthcare plan and more like a witch's shopping list, were thought to govern your health, your personality, and probably your luck with goats. The key to good health was keeping these humours in balance. If you had a fever and a racing pulse, you were obviously too hot-blooded and needed some leech time. A persistent cough, clearly an excess of phlegm, which could only mean it was time for purging or being wrapped in steamed cabbage leaves. Now, take a seat next to any medieval herbalist, and you'd be greeted with the scent of rosemary, hope, and earnest confusion. Remedies from plants, that great green pharmacy of the earth, were either marvelously helpful or mildly hallucinogenic. In fairness, sometimes they were both. Many medieval concoctions didn't so much cure as they did distract. If you're too dizzy from poppy syrup to care about your infected toe, then technically your suffering has been addressed. But the real problem was less the herbs and more the absolute lack of germ theory. The idea that tiny invisible agents might be causing diseases was about as believable to most early societies as fairies organizing local government. Illness was often attributed to foul air, divine punishment, lunar mischief, or, when all else failed, the neighbor's jealous glance. Public health, as we know it today, didn't exist. Waste disposal was largely a matter of gravity and convenience, which is to say, people tossed things out of windows and prayed for rain. Drinking water ranged from slightly fishy to contains most of the lake. And hygiene? Well, it was frequently a matter of religious debate rather than scientific consensus. While some cultures embraced regular bathing, like the hygiene-loving Japanese and Romans, others grew wary of excessive cleanliness, fearing it left the body porous to disease, or worse, temptations of the flesh. So, yes, some folks avoided bathing for their health and their immortal soul. A bold strategy. In hospitals, which could be anything from a converted monastery to a place where the sick gathered to die semi-collectively, the air was heavy with incense and suffering. The line between a healer and a priest was paper thin, and in many regions, they were quite literally the same person. Treatment often included prayer as a central component, a quiet acknowledgement that when all else fails, it couldn't hurt to talk to someone upstairs. One mustn't forget the barbers either, the multitaskers of the medieval world. They could cut your hair, pull a tooth, or amputate your leg, often all in a single afternoon. Their iconic red and white striped poles, a nod to their bloodletting, and bandaging skills, which were considered slightly more artisanal than today's spa packages of cucumber masks and seaweed wraps. Despite the many setbacks, we mustn't laugh too hard at these early attempts. Behind every odd cure and mistaken belief was a genuine effort to understand suffering, to ease it, or at least to name it something complicated in Latin. In a world full of mystery, they did what they could with the tools and toads at hand. And so, the fevered nobleman with his onion poultice might never know modern antibiotics or even the true nature of his minor infection. But he would certainly be wrapped in warmth, watched over by candlelight, and whispered to by monks and matronly caregivers whose arts were stitched together with faith, folklore, and a dash of trial and error. Now drift gently with me as we tiptoe onward into the strange and surprisingly influential world of ancient medicine's most controversial champion, the wandering healer. In the waning light of a Stone Age evening, when the biggest threat to your survival was a sneeze from your neighbor, the human body was both battlefield and mystery. Illness floated invisibly in the air, or so they thought, drifting like mischievous spirits from person to person. And yet, despite their valiant attempts with poultices made of mashed beetle wings and herbs with names like Fox's Sneeze, the people could only watch, sniffle, and hope. Let's imagine you're a midwife in ancient Babylon, perhaps with a satchel of pungent herbs and a head full of chants. You'd know by the stars when a good day for healing was, and if the stars said no, well, better luck next season. You might not have, say, antibiotics. Those wouldn't pop up until a mouldy sandwich in the 20th century. But by heavens, you had incantations. Specifically, ones involving the moon god, a few goat hairs, and the strongest smelling root you could find. It wasn't that ancient healers were foolish. Quite the contrary. Many of them had an intuitive understanding of the body that was, frankly, impressive, considering nobody had a microscope. And most thought the heart was directly involved in digestion. But the problem was that illness didn't announce itself with a label and a user manual. A simple stomachache might have been the result of bad lentils, or the wrath of a god you forgot to thank during Tuesday's prayer. Hard to say. Take the ancient Egyptians, ever fans of the afterlife. They were big on preserving the body, organs in jars posed for eternity, yet couldn't quite keep it functioning while it was still in use. Snakebite? Probably because you offended Osiris. Toothache? Time to shove a bit of cooked barley mixed with mouse brains into the saw. We're not making that up. Ancient Egyptian dentists had recipes that today would be rejected by even the most lenient cooking shows. But bless their cotton-wrapped hearts, they were trying. All the while, farmhands up and down the Nile were perishing from what might have been a strep infection, something modern antibiotics would knock out in an afternoon. Now consider medieval Europe, where the cause of illness was assumed to be either bad humours or bad morals. 4 bodily fluids governed everything: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The average doctor's day consisted of squinting at your complexion, declaring you had too much of one of those delightfully viscous elements, and prescribing either bleeding or burning. Possibly both. You could catch a chill and moments later be strapped to a chair while someone thoughtfully applied leeches to your armpit for balance. And if you were lucky enough to survive the treatment, you'd still hear the town bell toll as yet another person succumbed to a fever. Never mind what caused it: hotbeds of bacteria brewing in water barrels, unwashed hands, or perhaps that one cousin who coughed on everyone. The culprit was almost always labelled as miasma, a poetic way of saying bad air, as if wind had suddenly become a delinquent. Let's drift eastward to ancient China, where the elegant and intricate system of traditional Chinese medicine emerged. Here, the body was a delicate harmony between yin and yang, and illness occurred when the balance tipped the wrong way, perhaps because your spleen was being passive-aggressive. Pulses were read as though they were love letters from the organs, with seasoned practitioners able to diagnose everything from a head cold to heartbreak, steam, herbs, acupuncture, all combined in a careful dance meant to coax the body back into order. Still, with no antibiotics or understanding of viral replication, even a minor infection could turn terrifying. All across the world, the smallest ailments often carried the greatest risks. A small scratch on the wrong day could bloom into something fatal. A tickle in the throat might end in a soft funeral chant beneath the trees. Cleanliness was relative, water wasn't always safe, and even the most valiant warrior might fall to what we now call a cold. The irony, sweet, slumber-inducing irony, is that many of these civilizations believed themselves astoundingly advanced, and in several ways they were. They built pyramids, star charts, and aqueducts while unknowingly drenched in contagion. It wasn't stupidity that made small illnesses deadly. It was simply the absence of tools, of lenses, of a good old-fashioned bit of penicillin. And now, as the candle flickers low and history's whisper dissolves into a quiet hum, we edge gently toward the next mystery. Something awaits, soft, strange, and maybe just a little bit itchy. Somewhere in the chill of a medieval morning, a group of early physicians, or more accurately, men with large robes and even larger guesses, gathered around a patient with a cough. A minor cough, a dainty little throat clearing. Alas, to the medical minds of the 14th century, it might as well have been the trumpet call of destiny. That tickle in the throat could mean anything. A chill in the humours, a bad wind. Perhaps he had offended a saint with fish on a meat day, and so we find ourselves gazing into the oddly earnest face of medieval medicine, a curious parade of treatments for otherwise survivable ailments. You've probably heard the one about bloodletting, because of course, why keep all your blood? The very thing keeping you alive, when you could let some out and feel positively empty inside. If someone had a fever, that probably meant an excess of blood. Clearly, the best course of action was to poke a hole and drain a cup or two. Or, if you wanted to get fancy, apply leeches. Nothing says cutting edge like a freshwater parasite affixed to your ankle. But lest we be too unfair, let's remember they were doing their best with what they had, which mostly was inherited from Galen, a Roman physician whose theories were still considered hot medical gossip over 1,000 years later. Galen believed in balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If that doesn't sound like a medieval vending machine of bodily functions, I don't know what does. Feeling nauseous, too much yellow bile, melancholy, that'll be a touch of black bile, my friend. And if you sneezed, well, best call the priest just to be safe. Doctors or apothecaries or barbers who'd read half a scroll often treated illnesses by expelling the badness from the body. If you weren't getting your blood let out, you might be induced to vomit, or sneezed into oblivion, or purged in ways we wouldn't dare describe so close to a bedtime story. Even minor infections could spiral downward because, say, your battlefield scrape was washed with a rag that previously dried a sick goat. It was not the golden age of antiseptic. Now, tucked quietly into the herbal pages of this period, there were remedies that worked-ish. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, an early relative of aspirin, and honey, often slathered on wounds, does have antimicrobial properties. But for every workable remedy, there were 20 involving cow dung, crushed emeralds, boiled hedgehog, or a general distrust of garlic if Mercury was in retrograde. And then there was astrology. Physicians often consulted the stars, not as a source of inspiration, but as a literal diagnostic guide. Got a sore throat? Blame Mars being in Taurus. Liver trouble? Classic Saturn behavior. If Venus and Jupiter were having a cosmic disagreement, best not undergo any tooth extractions. No one wants galactic drama in their gum line. Diagnosing was a spectacle all to itself. The uroscopy flask was a prized possession. Doctors would examine your urine's colour, smell, and even taste, yes, taste, before deciding what spiritual rebalancing you needed. If your urine was cloudy with a chance of jaundice, you might be ordered to rest indoors while burning rosemary and contemplating your sins. As if plague and sanitation issues weren't enough, early people often lacked any meaningful descriptions of germs. The concept of invisible microbial life was centuries away. Illnesses were blamed on miasmas, bad air, or divine punishment. And frankly, the church, state, and your neighbour Margaret all agreed that if your crops failed and your toe turned black, you'd probably angered somebody upstairs. Confession and penance were about as close to antibiotics as things got. It also didn't help that doctors were scarce, expensive, and often busy attending to nobility. Most regular folks turned to local wise women or herbalists. These community healers often knew far more about effective remedies, though their success could also get them accused of witchcraft if the timing was poor or someone got a little too healthy too quickly. One woman's miraculous nettle poultice was another man's heresy. So yes, when simple illnesses danced through ancient streets, they often left behind tragic tales. Fevers, infected cuts, or even a case of the quinsy, a pleasant old name for tonsil abscesses, could mean lights out, all for lack of soap and a little penicillin. And yet, There's something gently awe-inspiring about early societies trying to make sense of the chaos inside the human body. They saw it all as part of a cosmic order, where the stars sang, humors swayed like orchestra sections, and health was a delicate balance between bile, mood, and divine favor. Now, let's quietly drift onward, toward a curious invention that forever changed our germ-ridden story, the birth of public health. In the dim, candle-lit corners of a medieval village, where shadows danced lazily against crumbling stone walls and the smell of herbs was overpowered by less poetic aromas, the role of superstition in medicine was not just common. It was practically clinical policy. Before we had the concept of germ theory, there was, well, a lot of guesswork. The kind of guesswork that made leeches feel like cutting-edge technology. If you were sick, it could be because you'd stared too long at the moon, or maybe a frog crossed your path from the left. Either way, you'd better find the nearest wise woman, priest, or goat, whichever was currently regarded as the most qualified healer. Humours were the big idea for centuries. Not the funny kind, unfortunately, but the ones Aristotle and his brainy gang insisted lived inside your body. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which, to be clear, were not Gatorade flavours. If you had a cold, perhaps your phlegm levels were staging a coup, too much melancholy, probably an overflow of black bile, in which case a nice bloodletting should brighten your spirits. And who, pray tell, administered the bloodletting? Often barbers. Yes, those red and white poles outside barbershops. They come from this practice. The red symbolized blood, the white represented bandages. So while Humphrey the barber might tidy up your mustache, he might also relieve you of a pint of blood, while humming a tune about turnip stew. Multitasking, medieval style. Then there were the pop-up remedy trends. Snake oil, for example, got its fair share of believers. Elephant's toenails crushed into powder might cure a cough. Boiled owl sprinkled with lavender couldn't hurt. The farther the ingredient came from your actual habitat, the more mystical it seemed. If someone in the 13th century told you a bezoar stone from a Persian goat's stomach could neutralize poison, well, that was practically science. Of course, not all ancient treatments were complete nonsense. Honey, for instance, was a tried and true antimicrobial. Garlic really could help knock back certain infections. But these moments of accidental accuracy were often lost in a smorgasbord of rituals involving moon phases, relics of saints, and the then popular belief that wearing a necklace made of dried toad would keep fevers at bay. Fashionable and medicinal, sort of. Naturally, illness was often political too. Royalty could afford exotic cures, imported doctors, or at the very least, a different kind of toad necklace, perhaps one dipped in crushed emerald. If common folk got sick, they were usually given a firm pat on the back and a large cup of hope. Of course, divine punishment was a popular explanation across classes. Coughing might have sinned too much, plague, likely a cosmic smiting. The church occasionally advised people to fast, flagellate, or confess more enthusiastically. Then maybe the Lord would take pity on your kidneys. One must not forget the charming treatments of early surgery. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, the village bone setter would often just pour some homemade wine into your mouth, count to 3, possibly in the wrong order, and proceed with a sharp knife and a prayer. The good news: you probably passed out before the procedure really got going. Despite this improvisational approach to wellness, communities did develop their own folk medicinal knowledge. Native plants, poultices, and time-tested remedies passed down through generations. But formal institutions weren't much help. Medieval universities spent more time debating how the stars affected your liver than studying patient symptoms. Astrology wasn't just a personality quiz, it was diagnostic protocol. Your appendix pain might be blamed on Mars being in a foul mood. Still, as much as we giggle at these historic hiccups, it's worth remembering they were doing their best with what they had. Patterns were all people had to go on. If your neighbor sneezed, then turned blue, and then all the cows died, well, that probably made perfect sense in the village ledger of omens. Logic sprinkled with folklore, held together by herbal tea and a suspiciously large number of saints. And so, while the common cold might have sent a whole neighborhood into a panic involving dandelion extract and goatfoot poultices, these moments were not just medical, they were cultural theater, where every sneeze could be divine or deadly, and where healing was as much about belief as biology. Now the candles burn lower, and the echoes of whispered prayers and bubbling tonics begin to fade. Let's ease back as night deepens further and drift toward one last chapter in this drowsy tale of sniffles and superstitions. Even as we tiptoe quietly through the shadows of medical history, one truth rustles like an old curtain in a drafty 18th century sick room. It wasn't just the plague or sword wounds or dramatic royal poisoning that got people. It was things like bad water, itchy bites, and sometimes their own doctors. Imagine this. It's the Middle Ages. You're a humble peasant named Ethelfrith. You've been stacking hay with reckless enthusiasm. Twist your ankle a bit and think, I'll walk it off. But you live in an era when walking it off usually leads to limping into eternity. A small injury, infected. A bad cough, worsens. A tiny flea, surprise guest star in your immune system's darkest episode, and you can forget popping an antibiotic. That magic was centuries away, still slumbering in the unopened penicillin mold in Alexander Fleming's Petri dish of destiny. Now, that's not to say people didn't have remedies. They did. Oh, they had remedies. Remedies involving moldy bread, sheep dung poultices, and in some unfortunate cases, blessed earth stuffed in curious places. They had potions, prayers, and enthusiastic leech collectors. But behind all this lay a much more basic misunderstanding. You see, people didn't always know why they were sick. They had theories, though. The ancient Greeks thought your body was a hotel of 4 liquids, or humours: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. Get too much of one, and you were in trouble. Too melancholy, that's probably excess black bile. Feeling spicy? Yellow bile, most likely. Though one suspects sometimes the diagnosis was just, you've offended the gods and also eaten too much cheese. Flash forward to the monastic hospitals of the medieval age, calm, candlelit, and gently echoing with Gregorian chant. The monks meant well, truly. Herbal gardens bloomed with curative potential. But when contaminated tools met open wounds in a world where soap was a lifestyle optional, infections strolled in like uninvited party guests. Even childbirth, which you'd hoped to be a warm and hopeful moment, came laced with peril. Without sterile tools or knowledge of germs, complications were handled with a mix of fervent prayer and sheer optimism, which, while comforting, rarely staved off sepsis. Diseases loved the cities, those bustling, wheat-scented labyrinths of muddy shoes, rat populations, and zero sanitation infrastructure. Streets were sometimes both highways and sewers. Cows walked alongside carts, and chamber pots were emptied from windows with alarming casualness. A sneeze, a single, unsuppressed medieval sneeze, could bloom into a firestorm of fever. The wealthy didn't fare much better. Their medicine came with more gold leaf and fewer results. Royal physicians were often overly confident, undertrained, and disturbingly fond of purging. And if maggots showed up in a wound, there was a decent chance someone would say, "Ah yes, God's little surgeons," and leave them to their wriggling work. What's most curious, though, is how resilience thrived in such a harrowing context. Communities looked after each other. Herbalists passed down knowledge. Midwives guided births. Mothers learned which leaves soothed a fever. And old grandmothers somehow knew how to make tea that fixed everything. Even if sometimes it was only fixing it with hope. History, as it turns out, isn't just the record of kings and wars and inexplicably large roughs. It's a quiet chronicle of people who kept going despite having absolutely no idea what germs were, who stitched, brewed, whispered prayers, and inched us, very slowly, toward better nights and brighter mornings. And now, here you are, wrapped in a warm blanket, alive in an age where you can Google symptoms instead of swallowing powdered toad. Modern medicine, with all its beeping machines and complicated Latin, is not perfect, but it is a marvel. So close your eyes now. Let the aches of history tangle softly with your dreams. No need for leeches tonight, just sleep, safe and stitched with all the wisdom and mistakes of those who came before. Every sneeze and soothed cough a thread toward progress. And if you feel warmth swelling in your chest, it's either gratitude or perhaps just the cat settling in for a nap.